Subscribe to Dust and Devotion Tales. New stories every day. Don't miss out.
The air over Cinder Ridge was thick, like stagnant blood. On that day, the sun did not shine. It pressed down heavy and orange through a veil of dust driven by the eastern wind. In these parts, the wind never brought relief. It only rearranged the ashes of a starving land from one place to another. Silas Vance stood on the porch of his house, his shoulder leaning against a blackened post. His palm rested habitually on the grip of an old Colt. Not out of fear, but out of habit, the way a man presses his hand to an aching tooth, hoping to still the pulsing emptiness within. Silas was a man whose face resembled the landscape of the desert itself. Deep furrows at the corners of his eyes, parched lips, and a gaze where hope had long since burned out, leaving only the cold ash of resolve. Far off on the horizon, where the sky merged with the shimmering haze of the earth, a speck appeared. It moved slowly, haltingly, like a wounded beast trying to crawl to a watering hole. It was the mail coach, the only thread connecting Silas to the world he had renounced 7 years ago. "Is she coming, Papa?" A voice drifted from below, from the shadow beneath the porch. There in the dust sat little Arthur. The boy was 6, but he hardly ever played. His only friend was a wooden soldier with a broken arm, which he constantly turned in his thin fingers. Arthur was the catalyst of Silas's pain, a living reminder of the woman the soil of Cinder Ridge had taken in the very first winter. "She's coming," Silas clipped. His voice sounded like the snap of dry twigs. "Remember what I told you. She's here to cook and wash. Ask for nothing more." The coach stopped in a cloud of acrid dust. The horses breathed heavily, their flanks heaving, covered in the white salt of sweat. The door creaked, a sound so sharp that Arthur flinched, clutching his broken soldier to his chest. A woman stepped out of the coach. She wore a faded blue shawl that seemed like a foreign object amidst this brown void. She did not look like the brides from the catalogs, rosy-cheeked and smiling. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were vast and dark, like two wells with an eternal night frozen at the bottom. In her hands, she clutched a heavy valise, its handle reinforced with twine. Silas descended one step. He felt the air grow colder, a sure sign that by evening the desert would trade the wrath of heat for icy indifference. "Katrina?" he asked, though he knew the answer. The woman did not respond. She only tilted her head slightly, a gesture so full of melancholy that Silas felt a momentary pang in his chest. She uttered not a word. She looked at Silas, then at the house, which looked like the skeleton of a great whale bleached on a shore, and finally her gaze fell upon Arthur. The boy rose slowly. He approached her, ignoring his father's stern call. Katrina knelt right there in the dust, unconcerned for her dress. She reached out a slender hand and touched the broken soldier. "He's hurt," Arthur whispered. Katrina looked at the child, and something flickered in her eyes that Silas couldn't grasp, either recognition or profound sympathy. She pulled a scrap of scarlet ribbon from her shawl pocket and slowly, carefully bound the broken arm of the figurine. "Is she mute?" Silas turned to the driver, who was already hurrying to leave. "Hasn't made a sound since she boarded in Denver, Mr. Vance," the man grunted. "They say trouble found her in Kansas. She's the last of her kin. Quiet one she is, quiet as a grave." The driver lashed the horses and tore away, leaving the three of them in the gathering dusk. The weather began to sour completely. Distant thunder growled somewhere behind the ridge, promising a dry storm, the most dangerous kind, where lightning strikes dry grass without bringing a single drop of rain. "Get inside," Silas said, taking her valise. "In these parts, silence doesn't live long. Either you start talking, or the wind will speak for you." Katrina rose. She looked at Silas, and there was a double meaning in that look. She wasn't born mute. She was mute by choice. Her silence was a shield, behind which she hid what could destroy Cinder Ridge faster than any drought. They entered the house. Inside it smelled of old wood and a cold hearth. Silas pointed to a room at the end of the hallway. "Your room. Supper in an hour. I don't like to wait, and I don't like questions asked with the eyes." He went into the kitchen, leaving her alone. Katrina entered the room, set her valise on the bed, and walked to the window. Outside, the first lightning bolt cut the sky into two uneven halves. Illuminating the yard for a second, she saw Arthur standing by the fence, looking at his mended toy. The scarlet ribbon on the soldier was the only bright spot in this dying world. Supper was served in a silence so heavy it felt as though the walls were leaning in. Silas sat across from her, eating with the focused intensity of a man performing a chore, not a ritual. He watched her over the rim of his tin cup. "Silence is a convenient lie," Silas said suddenly, his voice dropping an octave. "People think if they don't speak, their secrets stay dead. But here on the ridge, the earth has ears. The wind will pull everything you're hiding right out of you. If you think this ranch is a place to hide from the law or the devil, you're mistaken. The devil lives 5 miles from here in the canyon, and he doesn't take kindly to strangers." Arthur reached for Katrina's hand. Silas stiffened. "Don't touch her, Arthur. She isn't here to replace your mother. She's here so the house doesn't smell of rot and neglect." Katrina did not pull away. Instead, she gently covered the boy's hand with her own. Her skin was cool, while his was hot with childhood impatience. In that moment, a bond formed that Silas could not break with a shout or a bullet. It was the first rebellion in his ordered world of shadows. "Work starts tomorrow." Silas rose, pushing his chair back with a harsh scrape. "We rise an hour before the sun. I'll show you the well. Water is worth its weight in gold here, so don't you go wasting it. And another thing," he hesitated, glancing at her valise. "Keep your door closed, not because I'm afraid of you, but because I don't want to know that you're crying at night. This house has soaked up enough tears. It can't hold any more." He walked out, the door thudding shut behind him. Katrina remained in the dim kitchen. The storm outside finally broke, with a clap of thunder that rattled the glass, yet no rain fell. Only dust, kicked up by the wind, lashed the windows like 1,000 tiny bones. She looked at Arthur. The boy was still clutching his soldier. "She won't go away?" he whispered. Katrina shook her head. She picked up a piece of charcoal that had fallen from the stove, and on the wooden surface of the table, she slowly drew a small sun and a mountain beside it. Then she pointed to the sun and then to Arthur. "Tomorrow there will be light," the drawing said. The boy smiled for the first time in a long while. Katrina felt the letter beneath her corset, the paper burning against her skin. A letter addressed to Julian Blackwood, the man Silas Vance had sworn to kill if he ever stepped foot on Cinder Ridge. She blew out the lamp. Darkness swallowed the kitchen, and only the smell of char and the approaching dry storm remained to remind her that this night was only the beginning of a long journey through ash and pain. The sun had not yet touched the jagged edge of Cinder Ridge when the door to Katrina's room shuddered under a heavy strike. In this house there was no tenderness in waking. Here the day began like a military campaign, abrupt, cold, and without the right to weakness. Get up! Silas's voice through the door was devoid of sleep. The desert doesn't wait for you to find your rest. If you want bread, you must first earn the right to the air you breathe. Katrina was already awake. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed, dressed in her traveling gown, which had soaked up the scent of dust and old wood overnight. She did not light the lamp. In the gray pre-dawn gloom, her face looked as though it were carved from marble. She touched the letter hidden in the folds of her clothes. It was her secret burden, her only link to a world where words still existed. When she stepped onto the porch, the world was painted in cold blues and grays. The air was prickly and dry. Silas was waiting by the well, a massive structure of wild stone that looked like an altar to some forgotten and cruel god of water. Water is life, Katrina. Silas pointed to a heavy oak bucket. But here, it demands sweat. Every sip you take today must be paid for. Fill the troughs for the cattle. And don't you dare spill a drop. The earth here is greedy. It'll lick up anything you drop and ask for more. He tossed her a rough rope. Katrina took it, and the calluses on Silas's hands momentarily brushed her skin. It was a contrast of two worlds, his, scorched by the sun and beaten by life, and hers, hidden behind silence and the refined manners of the past. She began to work. Each bucket pulled from the depths echoed with pain in her shoulders. Silas stood at a distance, arms crossed over his chest, watching. He was waiting for her to break. He wanted to see the tears that would prove his theory, that city women had no place among the ashes. But Katrina only pressed her lips tighter. Her silence became her strength. With every creak of the well's winch, she seemed to draw from the earth not just water, but her own right to stay. By midday, when the heat began to shimmer over the ground, Silas led her to a far pen hidden in the shadow of the old barn. There, in a silence broken only by the dry rustle of the wind, lay a massive dog, a cross between a wolf and a mastiff. Its left hind leg was clamped in a heavy iron trap that Silas had been unable to remove. The dog growled, baring yellow fangs, and in its bloodshot eyes was the same wild rage that lived in Silas's own. "That's Shadow," Silas said, and for the first time a note of something like respect crept into his voice. "He tripped that trap 3 days ago. He won't let me near him. He'd sooner tear his own throat out than let a man touch his pain. I'll give him one more day. If he doesn't give in, I'll have to end his misery with a bullet." Katrina approached the fence. Shadow instantly lunged as far as the trap allowed, letting out a guttural roar that made little Arthur, standing nearby, catch his breath. "Stay back from him," Silas barked. "He knows no mercy. He sees only an enemy in you." But Katrina did not move back. She slowly sank to her knees in the dust, just as she had done for Arthur. She did not look the beast in the eye. She knew a direct gaze was a challenge. Instead, she began to hum. It was a melody without words, a melancholy tune her mother used to sing in the shaded gardens of Virginia. The sound of her voice, quiet, almost ghostly, pierced the dry air of the ranch. Silas froze. He had never heard her sing. It was the sound of life pushing through the ash. The dog fell silent. His ears twitched. He still bared his teeth, but his posture shifted into doubt. Katrina extended her hand, a hollow palm turned upward. There was a double meaning in the gesture. "I have no weapon, and I accept your pain as my own." "She's mad," Silas whispered, but he did not take a single step to stop her. Something in the scene, a fragile woman facing a furious beast, held him spellbound. Katrina continued to hum, and with every beat, Shadow sank lower until his head touched his paws. The trap still bit into his flesh. but the growl had turned into a piteous whimper. It was the first triumph of silence over violence. Throughout the rest of the day, Silas tried not to look at Katrina. He retreated to the far pastures, venting his inexplicable anxiety by repairing the fence. The strike of his hammer echoed through the valley like distant cannon fire. Every blow was an attempt to drive down the thoughts her singing had awakened in him.
By evening, the heat became unbearable. The air stood still, turning into transparent glass through which the world appeared distorted and malicious. Silas returned to the house as the shadows grew long and sharp as knives. He found Katrina in the backyard by Shadow's pen. She was sitting on the ground, a few feet from the snarling dog, polishing an old copper basin. "He still wants to rip your throat out," Silas said, stopping behind her. "Beasts don't forgive traps, Katrina, even if you weren't the one who set them." Katrina looked up at him. She didn't answer, but pointed to a bowl of water she had managed to slide toward the dog while Silas was in the field. Shadow had drunk every drop, and now his gaze was not of rage, but of longing. "You think kindness is a cure," Silas smirked, but there was no joy in it. "But in these parts, kindness is just a reprieve. I set that trap for coyotes taking calves. Shadow was just in the wrong place at the wrong time, like most of us." He crouched beside her. He smelled of sweat, salt, and bitter tobacco. "Tomorrow I'll try to spring those jaws. If he bites me, it's on your conscience. You gave him hope, and hope makes beasts unpredictable." Katrina suddenly went still. Her hand instinctively moved to the collar of her dress, where the letter was hidden. The gesture did not escape Silas. His eyes narrowed. "You're hiding something." It wasn't a question. "Since you stepped off that coach, you've acted like you have a rattlesnake in your shirt. What is it, Katrina? A letter from a lover who didn't save you in time, or an arrest warrant?" She shook her head. Her face remained a mask, but her breathing quickened. Silas leaned in close, so close she could see every spark of anger in his pupils. "There is no room in this house for secrets that don't belong to me," he whispered. "I bought your presence, but I didn't buy your mysteries. If you brought trouble here, better say it now before the wind carries your scent across the valley. Julian Blackwood and his men are prowling. If you're one of those they're looking for—" At the mention of that name, Katrina flinched so hard the copper basin slipped from her hands, hitting the stones with a hollow clang. Shadow barked in his pen, choking in pain and fury. "Blackwood, then." Silas's voice turned cold as winter ice. "I see. A mute bride with a loud past." He turned and walked into the house without looking back. Katrina remained in the dust. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She knew Silas hated Blackwood, the man who once owned these lands and would stop nothing to take them back. The letter in her pocket was the key to peace between them, but now it felt like a death sentence. She entered the house as Arthur slept, clutching his soldier with the scarlet ribbon. In her room, she stared at the sealed envelope. There was no sender's name, only the address, Blackwood Hall, to be delivered by hand. She knew, if Silas found this, he would cast her out into the desert. But she also knew the content of this letter was the only thing that could save Arthur when Blackwood came for Silas's debts. She blew out the candle. In the darkness, she heard Silas pacing in his room, measuring the floor like a prisoner in a cell. Two people, separated by a single wall and 1,000 secrets, waited for the dawn, unaware that tomorrow would bring the first blood and the first true test of their fragile union. The dawn of the third day was cold and dry. The sky over Cinder Ridge did not bloom with pink. It simply faded from black to a dingy gray, like a worn-out sheet. Silas Vance had not slept. He had spent the night cleaning his gear, the saddle, the harness, and his old holster. The creak of leather in the silence of the house sounded like the groan of a ghost. When Katrina stepped into the kitchen, he was already at the window, buckling a wide leather belt lined with cartridges. He wore his battered hat low, the shadow concealing his eyes and making his face look like a skull. "Today we settle the matter with Shadow," he said, without turning. "Either I take that cursed metal off his leg, or he goes to the better hunting grounds. Arthur, stay in the house. Bolt the door." The boy, pale and quiet, nodded while clutching his wooden soldier. Katrina looked at Silas. She saw the tension in his shoulders. He wasn't going to save a beast. He was going to war. To him, Shadow was an embodiment of everything wild and defiant he had tried to suppress in himself. They walked to the pen. The air was still, but it carried the metallic taste of a coming dust storm. Shadow lay in the corner, his breathing shallow and ragged. The trap had bitten deep into the swollen limb, and the first fat flies were already circling the iron. Silas took a long rope with a lariat loop, the tool of a man who lived by the laws of the horse and the rope. "I'll drop the loop over his neck and pull him to the post so he can't move," he explained. "You stay outside. If he breaks loose, run for the house. You hear me?" Katrina didn't move. She watched the dog, her heart tightening with recognition. She knew that violence only bred violence. If Silas began to choke the beast, it would fight until its last breath. Silas entered the pen. The heavy spurs on his boots clinked against the stones. Shadow lunged up instantly, the hair on his neck bristling. A low, guttural snarl filled the space. Silas swung the lariat. The loop whistled through the air and snapped tight around the dog's neck. What followed was a dance with death. Feeling the suffocation, the dog went mad. He thrashed, tearing his wounded leg even deeper, his eyes turning blood red. Silas dug his heels into the dirt, the muscles in his arms bulging like cables. "Give in, you devil," Silas wheezed. But Shadow would not give in. He lunged with such force that Silas lost his footing, dropping to one knee. In that moment, despite the trap, the dog leapt forward, aiming for his master's throat. Katrina didn't stop to think. She vaulted over the fence, ignoring Silas's roar of warning. She didn't grab the rope. Instead, she threw herself toward the dog's head and covered his eyes with her blue shawl. The world for Shadow suddenly vanished. The sudden darkness and the familiar scent of the woman, the scent of sage and silence, made him freeze for a fraction of a second. That second was all Silas needed to regain his grip and snub the rope against the post. Silence fell over the pen, broken only by the ragged breathing of man and beast. "You," Silas panted, looking up at Katrina. "You could have been killed. Do you have any idea what you've done? You broke every rule of survival on this ridge." Katrina slowly pulled her hands away from the dog's head. Shadow was still trembling under the shawl, but he no longer tried to bite. She looked at Silas, and her gaze held no fear, only a quiet reproach. She pointed to the trap. Silas cursed under his breath, but the anger was gone. He reached for a pair of heavy blacksmith's pliers. "Hold his head. If he jerks, I'll crush the bone instead of freeing it." Katrina pressed the dog's head to her chest. She felt the frantic beat of the beast's heart, and the hot blood soaking her dress. Silas threw his weight against the lever of the trap. The metal groaned, resisting, and then, with a loud, clanging snap, the jaws of the trap flew open. Shadow let out a short, almost human moan and went limp in Katrina's arms. Silas tossed the bloody arm aside. It hit the rocks with a sound that marked the end of one pain and the beginning of another. He stood up, wiping sweat from his brow. His hands were shaking. He looked at his bride, her blue dress ruined with mud and blood, and for the first time, his eyes held something like reverence instead of suspicion. Not a cowboy in this valley would have risked that for a mad dog, he said softly. Why did you do it, Katrina? Why risk yourself for those who didn't ask? In that moment, the sound of hooves drifted from the road. A rider was approaching. By the way he sat in the saddle, languid with a low-slung holster, Silas knew instantly this was no guest. This was a warning. Blackwood sent his hound, Silas spat, reaching for his revolver. Get in the house. The real talk is about to start. The rider stopped a few yards from the gate, kicking up a cloud of red dust that settled on Silas's boots. It was a man in a dusty gray duster, his face pitted by smallpox and indifference. His horse, a lean mare branded with a double circle, pawed the ground. Silas recognized the brand, the mark of Julian Blackwood, a man who considered the entire valley his property. Vance, the rider didn't tip his hat. Mr. Blackwood is wondering if any lost souls wandered your way lately. From Kansas, or maybe from hell itself. Silas stepped forward, shielding Katrina. Cinder Ridge has many lost souls, Morgan, but only those I permit set foot on my land. Blackwood knows the rules. Tell him if he's looking for something, he should check his brothels, not my ranch. Morgan smirked, baring rotten teeth. His gaze slid past Silas to Katrina. Heard you sent for a bride. Only trouble is, the real Eleanor Hayes reportedly passed in Denver, and the one who took her place, she has a debt, a very large debt to the Blackwood family, and Mr. Blackwood doesn't like being robbed. Katrina felt a chill run down her spine. The letter in her pocket felt like a piece of red-hot lead. Get out. Silas's voice was dangerously quiet. If your mare takes one more step toward my gate, I'll blow your brains into the dirt, and Blackwood can hire a new messenger. Morgan slowly raised his hands, palms open, but there was no submission in the gesture. As you say, Silas, but remember, the drought is only beginning. Soon you'll need Blackwood's water, and when you come crawling, the price will be different. We know who she is, and we know what she's hiding. He wheeled his horse and galloped away. Silas stood still long after the hoofbeats died out. Then he turned to Katrina, his face pale with rage and disappointment. Inside, he barked. The house was dark and stifling. Silas paced the floor like a caged animal. Finally, he looked at her. So Blackwood, he said, you brought a war to my porch. You took a dead woman's name to hide under my shadow. You used me as a shield. Katrina walked to him. She knew the silence had to end. She slowly pulled the letter from her hidden pocket and laid it on the table. Silas stared at it. What is this? She took a piece of charcoal from the hearth and on a scrap of wrapping paper wrote 2 words, for Julian Blackwood. Silas recoiled as if struck. You came here to deliver a message to that murderer? You're his spy? He seized her by the shoulders, shaking her. Answer me. Do you know what he did to this valley? What he did to my family? Katrina didn't flinch. In her eyes was a depth of melancholy that made Silas loosen his grip. She took the charcoal again and wrote below, "To save Arthur." Silas froze. He looked at his son's name, written by the hand of a woman he barely knew. Outside, the dry storm finally broke with a crack of lightning. "My son needs no saving from the likes of Blackwood at the cost of betrayal," Silas whispered, but his voice broke. He picked up the letter. He didn't burn it. He crushed it in his fist. "I won't give you up, for now. No set of a momento. You are my prisoner, not my bride. You will work twice as hard, and if I see one Blackwood man within a mile, I'll kill you first." He walked out into the wind, leaving Katrina alone. She went to the sleeping Arthur and adjusted his blanket. The bones were cast. The desert had begun to take its price, and that price was higher than she could have ever imagined. The drought did not arrive as a guest. It came as an invader. By the end of the week, the grass in the valley had turned into brittle wire that crumbled into powder under the horses' hooves. The wells on neighboring ranches began to fail, and a stifling expectation of death hung in the air, thick with the scent of distant scorched earth. Silas Vance grew darker with every passing hour. The letter Katrina had given him lay in his pocket like an unexploded grenade, poisoning every step he took. "Supplies are low," he said one morning, cinching the saddle on his black stallion. "Salt, flour, ammunition, we need it all. I'm heading to Copper Bend. It's a 2-day ride there and back, provided the wind doesn't kick up a wall of dust." He turned to Katrina. His gaze was hard, but the icy hatred of the previous days had thawed into a restless anxiety he couldn't quite mask. "Listen to me carefully. Shadow was well enough to bark, but not well enough to fight. If you see riders, don't wait for a greeting. Take Arthur and get down into the cellar beneath the barn. You have my old shotgun. Do you know how to use it?" Katrina nodded in silence. She knew how to handle a weapon. It was another secret from her past in Kansas that Silas could only guess at. Her fingers remembered the cold weight of steel and the kick of a stock against her shoulder. "Good." Silas swung into the saddle. The creak of leather sounded like a sentence in the ranch's stillness. "If I'm not back by sunset on the second day, take the horses and head south to the Mexican border. Don't wait for me." He spurred his horse and vanished into the shimmering heat, leaving behind a silence that felt unnaturally loud. The first day passed in a grueling wait. Katrina worked until exhaustion, keeping her hands busy to quiet her mind. She watched Arthur play with the dog's Shadow on the porch. Shadow now followed the boy everywhere, limping on his mended leg, but never taking his eyes off the horizon. Nature itself seemed to hold its breath. Even the birds had ceased their songs, as if every living thing knew that trouble was coming to Cinder Ridge. By noon of the second day, the weather broke. The sky turned the color of old lead, and the wind shifted, bringing the smell of smoke. But it wasn't the scent of a forest fire. It was the acrid stench of burning timber. Shadow suddenly bolted upright and let out a low, vibrating snarl. Katrina straightened, wiping sweat from her brow. On the horizon, rising from Blackwood's lands, 3 thin plumes of smoke ascended. A moment later, she heard the sound she feared most, the heavy, rhythmic thrum of many hooves. "Arthur, the cellar, now!" Her voice, unused for so long, came out raspy and commanding. The boy, seeing the look on her face, asked no questions. He grabbed Shadow by the collar and ran for the barn. Katrina stepped inside the house and took Silas's double-barreled shotgun from the wall. The weight was familiar, almost comforting. She checked the chambers, 2 brass cylinders, promising death to anyone who dared cross the threshold uninvited. She sat behind an oak water barrel on the porch. 4 riders approached. They didn't hide. They rode slowly, confident in their numbers, their dusters flapping in the wind like the wings of vultures. Morgan led the way. "Come on out, beautiful," Morgan shouted, reining in at the gate. "We know Silas is gone. The city rats told us he's drinking whiskey in Copper Bend. We have business with you. Hand over Blackwood's letter, and maybe we'll leave the house standing." Katrina didn't answer. She rested the barrels of the shotgun on the edge of the tub. Her breathing was steady. Her heart beat with a slow, mechanical precision. She watched one of the cowboys pull out a bottle filled with kerosene and strike a match. "Last chance," Morgan bellowed. "Where's the letter? Where's the boy?" In response, Katrina pulled the trigger. The roar of the shot shattered the valley's silence. The box shot struck the ground directly in front of Morgan's horse. The animal reared, throwing him into the dirt. Her second shot blew the bottle apart in the hands of another rider. Flames instantly engulfed his clothes and his horse's saddle. The screams of men and the panicked neighing of animals merged into a single nightmare of sound. "You bitch!" Morgan, scrambling in the dust, drew his revolver. Bullets splintered the wood of the porch. Katrina dove through the doorway, feverishly reloading. Her hands did not shake. In that moment, she was not a mute bride. She was the guardian of the small world Silas had entrusted to her. But she knew there were 4 of them and only 1 of her, and the shells in her belt were vanishing with terrifying speed. Smoke from the burning man's clothes filled the yard, mixing with the kicked-up dust. Katrina pressed her back against the wall beside the window. She heard Morgan shouting orders from behind the fence. "Circle the house," he roared. "Light the barn. If she won't come out, we'll smoke her out like a fox in a hole." Katrina knew Arthur was in that barn. Her heart skipped a beat, but she forced herself to focus. The cold calculation of a survivor took hold. She knew the layout of the house. The attic window looked directly over the backyard. She scrambled up the rickety ladder. From above, she saw the backs of 2 men creeping toward the barn with torches. She aimed. Silas's shotgun was old, but its aim was true. A blast, and one of Blackwood's men crumpled into the dry grass, dropping his fire. The second man recoiled in terror, firing blindly at the attic. A bullet grazed Katrina's cheek, leaving a trail of blood, but she didn't flinch. In her eyes burned the same fire Silas had seen in shadow, the fire of a creature with nothing left to lose. Just then, a sound drifted from the road that didn't belong to the outlaws. It was the heavy, rhythmic gallop of a horse pushed to its absolute limit. Silas Vance burst into the yard like a demon from the underworld. His stallion was lathered in foam, and he stood in his stirrups, firing both revolvers. He didn't scream, he didn't give orders, he simply killed. The first bandit took a bullet to the chest before he could even turn his mare. Morgan, seeing Silas, tried to mount his horse, but Silas's bullet shattered his shoulder. He tumbled back into the dust, howling. "Silas, behind you!" Katrina screamed, forgetting her silence. Her voice, torn and sharp, cut through the din of the fight. Silas ducked low over his horse's neck as the last man's bullet took the hat from his head. Silas's return shot found its mark. The final man fell like a sack of grain, and his horse, sensing freedom, bolted into the prairie. Silence followed, only broken by Silas's heavy breathing and Morgan's groans. Silas leapt from his horse and ran to the porch. Katrina was already coming down, her face stained with gunpowder and blood from the scratch on her cheek. They collided in the doorway. Silas grabbed her shoulders, his eyes searching hers. "Arthur?" he gasped. "In the cellar, alive," she answered. Silas closed his eyes for a second, pressing his forehead against hers. He smelled of the trail, whiskey, and cordite. It was the first time he held her, not as a prisoner, but as an equal, a comrade in arms. "You spoke," Silas whispered, pulling back to look at her in disbelief. "You called my name." Katrina touched her throat as if unable to believe it herself. The secrets she had kept, the stitches she had used to close her soul, had come undone in the heat of battle.
After the raid by Morgan, the silence on the ranch changed. It was no longer heavy and hostile. Now it was like a taut violin string, ready to snap at the slightest touch. Silas and Katrina barely spoke, but their movements became synchronized, like a team of oxen in a single harness. They reinforced the house, boarding up the windows and leaving only narrow slits for shooting, while moving the water reserves into the cellar. Silas worked with the ferocity of a man who had finally found an enemy he could look in the eye. His Colt never left his holster, and a Winchester rifle always stood by the front door. But in the evenings, once Arthur had fallen asleep, Silas would sit by the hearth and watch Katrina for a long time. She sat opposite him, darning his old shirt, the firelight dancing across her face and softening the sharp shadows of exhaustion. "You could have gone to the city with that letter, to the sheriff," he said one night, breaking the silence. "Why did you come here, to this God-forsaken place, knowing Blackwood would send killers for you?" Katrina set her sewing aside. Her voice, used more often now, still held that melancholy rasp that reminded him of dry grass rustling in the wind. "Sheriffs in these parts are cheaper than a pack of tobacco, Silas. I watched Blackwood buy judges and burn the homes of those who refused him. I knew the only man who wouldn't fear his blood was the man he had already taken everything from." Silas smirked, and for the first time there was no bitterness in it. "He took Anna from me, but he didn't know he left me with hate. And hate is a fine fuel, Katrina. It warms better than this hearth." "Hate burns you from the inside out," she answered softly, her dark eyes meeting his. "It leaves no room for the things worth living for. Look at Arthur. He fears your gaze more than he fears the storm." Silas flinched as if she had touched an old wound. He looked at the closed door of the child's room. Shadow, the dog, lay right across the threshold, faithfully guarding the boy's sleep. The dog's wounded leg was almost healed, though he still favored it, a permanent reminder of the trap. "I don't know any other way," Silas whispered. "On Cinder Ridge, you're either the hammer or the iron." Katrina stood and walked to him. She placed her hand on his broad, calloused palm. It was a fleeting touch, but Silas went still, afraid to startle the moment. Outside, the weather seemed to mirror their state. The wind died down, and an ominous, stifling silence fell. The horizon turned an ink-black blue, herald of a storm the valley hadn't seen in decades. "He'll come tomorrow," Katrina said. "I can feel it in my skin. Blackwood doesn't like to wait, and he doesn't like his letters read by those for whom they weren't intended." Silas covered her hand with his own. His fingers were rough, but his grip was surprisingly gentle. "Let him come. Cinder Ridge has waited long enough for this reckoning. And this time, Katrina, you won't be standing behind me. You'll be right beside me." The night before the battle was endless. Silas insisted Katrina sleep at least a couple of hours while he kept watch on the porch, but sleep wouldn't come. She heard the wind beginning to howl in the cracks of the boards, the weather vane on the barn creaking. The air grew humid and heavy. The drought was ending in a great celestial wrath. Around 4 in the morning, Silas stepped into the house. He was saturated with the scent of ozone and the approaching rain. "They're here," he clipped. Shadow caught their scent. 6 at least, Blackwood's leading. Katrina jumped up instantly, checking her cartridge belt and grabbing the shotgun. Arthur was already awake, sitting in the corner of the cellar, hugging the dog. Shadow didn't bark. He only growled low, his hackles raised.
"Arthur, listen to me." Silas descended to his son. He took the boy's face in his large hands and for the first time in years kissed his forehead. "Whatever you hear up there, do not come out. Shadow will protect you. You understand me?" The boy nodded, his eyes welling with tears, but he didn't make a sound. Silas climbed out and bolted the cellar lid, covering it with a heavy rug. They took their positions at the windows. In the distance, through the veil of the starting downpour, the riders appeared. They didn't hurry. In the center, on a snow-white stallion that looked like a ghost in the pre-dawn gloom, rode Julian Blackwood. He wore a fine black duster and a silk neckerchief. He wasn't riding to war. He was coming to collect his property. "Vance!" Blackwood's voice was carried by the wind, echoing over the valley. "Come out. I've come from my maid and what she stole. Give her to me, and I'll let you leave this hole alive. You have a minute, Silas." Silas looked at Katrina. She took aim, her finger resting on the trigger. At that moment, the first bolt of lightning struck the peak of the ridge, illuminating everything in a deathly white glare. "My wife believed you too, Blackwood," Silas roared back, "until you poisoned the well. Today you'll drink the same water she did." Blackwood raised his hand, and in the next heartbeat, bullets hammered against the house walls. Chaos erupted. Thunder merged with the crack of gunfire. Katrina fired methodically, knocking riders from their saddles one by one. She saw one of the outlaws fall and crawl toward the barn, but Shadow, who had squeezed out of the cellar through a gap Arthur had left in his fear, lunged out and caught him by the throat. Silas fired his Winchester, keeping the enemies from the porch, but the bandits were many, and they began to flank the house. A bullet shattered the lamp on the table, and the oil flared up, instantly catching the curtains. "Fire!" Silas shouted. Katrina threw herself at the flames with her shawl, the same blue shawl that had once calmed a rabid dog. In that moment, the front door shuddered under a massive blow. Blackwood had decided to finish this personally. The door flew off its hinges, and Blackwood's silhouette appeared in the doorway, revolver in hand. Silas spun around, but his rifle was empty. He reached for his Colt, but Blackwood was faster. A shot rang out. Silas groaned and slumped against the wall, clutching his shoulder. "You were always a failure, Silas," Blackwood spat, stepping into the burning house. "You couldn't keep Anna, and you won't keep this ranch." He aimed at Silas's head, but out of the smoke stepped Katrina. In her hands was the old shotgun, loaded with its final shell. "Leave him, Julian." Her voice was hard as stone. "The letter is in my head. Every sin, every word. If you fire, you'll never know where the original confessions are hidden, the ones I sent to Denver." Blackwood froze, his eyes narrowed. He hadn't expected the mute servant to be his worst nightmare. Just then, the sky exploded with another bolt of lightning behind him, and Arthur appeared on the threshold, clutching his wooden soldier. "Papa!" the boy cried. Blackwood's attention flickered for a split second to the child's voice.
That second was all Silas needed to kick the revolver from his enemy's hand. They grappled in a fierce struggle on the floor of the burning house. Katrina stood over them, shotgun ready, but they were locked so tightly she feared hitting Silas. Outside, the storm reached its peak. Torrents of water slammed against the roof, dousing the flames. The house filled with steam and smoke. Silas, gathering his last strength, landed a devastating blow to Blackwood's jaw and threw him toward the exit. Blackwood fell onto the porch where Shadow was already waiting. The dog pinned him to the ground, snarling inches from his face. "Finish it, Silas," Katrina whispered, stepping beside him. Silas raised his Colt. He looked at Blackwood, who now looked like a pathetic old man who had lost all his grandeur in the mud and rain. Then Silas looked at Arthur, who was trembling, pressing against Katrina. "No," Silas said, lowering his weapon. "Death is too easy an exit for him. We're taking him to Copper Bend. Let him rot in irons, watching his empire turn to dust." He turned to Katrina and Arthur. The rain washed the blood and soot from their faces. The storm still raged, but for the first time in 7 years, it was quiet on Cinder Ridge. Katrina's silence had finally brought peace. The storm departed as abruptly as it had arrived, leaving behind a world that felt scrubbed clean and strangely new. The air, which only yesterday had choked with heat, was now cool and carried the sharp, sweet scent of wet sage. Over Cinder Ridge, the sun began its slow ascent, not a blood-red, angry orb, but a tender gold, tentatively touching the scarred earth. Silas Vance stood on the porch of his home. His left shoulder was tightly bound with strips of the same blue shawl Katrina had used to save them in the fire. He watched the road leading toward Copper Bend. The previous evening, the sheriff and his deputies had hauled Julian Blackwood away in irons. The great king of the valley looked pathetic in his sodden silk clothes, his eyes darting, searching for a salvation that no longer existed. The empire built on poison and fear had crumbled into dust under the first drops of rain. Katrina stepped out to join him, carrying 2 mugs of steaming coffee. She no longer hid her face, and her gait had lost the cautious skittishness she'd arrived with. She walked to Silas and stood beside him, shoulder to shoulder. "You're free, Katrina," Silas said softly, taking a mug. His fingers brushed hers, and this time he did not pull away. "Blackwood will talk to save his own hide, but he'll never return here. There's enough money from the sale of his seized cattle for you to start a new life in St. Louis or even Chicago. You don't have to pretend to be anyone's bride anymore." Katrina looked toward the horizon. Down in the bottomland, Arthur was running with Shadow. The dog, favoring his leg, barked playfully, and the boy laughed, sounds that would have seemed impossible on this ranch only a week ago. "I've been running for 7 years, Silas." Her voice was calm and deep. "I changed names, cities, and masks. I thought freedom was when no one knew who you were. But here, amidst the ash and the blood, I learned something else. Freedom is when you no longer have to be silent before the one who sees your scars." Silas turned to her, his face, etched with lines and marked by yesterday's flight, suddenly smoothed. "I don't have much of a way with words, and this house still smells of smoke. But if you stay, I promise there won't be a silence in this home that makes you want to scream. I'll learn to listen, Katrina. and I'll teach Arthur that a man isn't the one who strikes first, but the one who builds the fence to protect the ones he loves." They spent the day restoring what had been broken. Silas repaired the torn-off door, while Katrina scrubbed the soot from the walls. Arthur found an old tin of paint in the shed, and alongside his father, painted the gate a stark, clean white. It was a symbol of a new boundary, a line drawn between a past full of pain and a future they were only beginning to map out. As evening approached, Silas led Katrina to the hill where the sun set behind the ridge. There, beneath a lone oak, stood a simple wooden cross, Anna's grave. Silas stood in silence for a long time, his hat held at his chest. The wind rustled the leaves, seeming to whisper a long-awaited forgiveness. "I thought I was being faithful to her with my grief," Silas said, staring at the cross. "But I was just building a tomb around myself and my son. Anna never wanted us to live in the shadow of her death. She loved the light." He bent down and placed a bundle of wildflowers that Arthur had gathered on the way. Then he turned to Katrina and pulled a small ring from his pocket, a thin gold band with a tiny turquoise stone. This was hers. She wanted me to give it to the one who brought life back to this house. "I'm not asking you to take her place, Katrina. You have your own. But I'm asking you to become a part of this land, for real this time, without letters or secret trades." Katrina reached out. Silas slowly slid the ring onto her finger. It was cool at first, but a moment later it warmed against her skin. She didn't say a word, but her gaze said more than any vial could. She drew him close and kissed him, a kiss both tender and bitter, tasting of the years survived and the peace to come. A single star rose over Cinder Ridge. It wasn't alone. Others soon flickered to life beside it, forming the patterns the people of the frontier called guiding lights. They walked back down to the house where a warm lamp already glowed in the window. Arthur waited for them on the threshold, hugging Shadow. The dog lifted his head and let out a short, approving bark. The past remained in the letters burned in the hearth. The present was here, in the smell of fresh bread, in a child's laughter, and in hands that were no longer afraid to touch. The story of the mail-order bride had ended, and the story of a family forged in fire and cleansed by rain had begun. Silas bolted the door, but this time it wasn't to lock the world out, it was to keep the warmth in. Night fell over Cinder Ridge, but it was a night followed by a clear and quiet dawn.